Hi and welcome to the Ninja Nunchuk, all about levitating into the fifth dimension. Actually, I'm going to take us back and we're going to cover all seven vibrational consciousness dimensions, or what we're going to call locations, to avoid confusion with the scientific dimension. Now, we're going to start with 0D, the initial dimension, the initial location where the non-duality, great creator, great consciousness exists, the source of all and everything. There's the great creator lounging about, just being aware of awareness and sensing itself. And suddenly, through the impetus of evolution, the great creator element, it gets an impetus, it gets a thought, and it gets curious about what might be possible. And this curiosity leads it to develop the first locational dimension, and that's 1D. 1D is a place where thought beings exist. As the great consciousness has a thought, it pops into the 1D location. Now, it needs the 1D location because in 0D there's no space. There's no gaps. Everything is contained and exists as one. In 1D, the great consciousness introduces the concept of time. This is where time is created in 1D. And this is a different time to what scientists are attributing to the fourth dimension, which is really the going back in time and the going forward in time, etc. This concept of time is really space. The great consciousness creates space because as it has a thought being gets created. As it has another thought being gets created. And in order to differentiate between these thought beings, then space, a gap of time, needs to be created so that each one can be individual thought beings. Now, these thought beings all go around having their own thoughts, and every time a different thought comes up, a new thought being is created, and we get thousands and thousands and millions and trillions and billions and quadrillions of thoughts, all being generated and created in 1D. And each thought being is constantly only focusing on its own thought. It's only got its one thought, and like a lot of humans these days, it gets stuck in its own head and it goes back over and over and over the same thought constantly. So the great creator decides, hang on, we're running out of space here. This is just too much effort to keep all of these thoughts going. I need to introduce a new concept, a new attribute here. And then we get what I'm calling 1D plus created, a kind of altered location of 1D with additional attributes. And these additional attributes are death. This is where death is created in 1D plus. And death is the introduction of entropy, and entropy is really the dissolution of energy, where energy returns back into a chaotic form. So in a thought being, energy is condensed into thoughts. So when that thought being dies, the energy is dissolved back into the great energy system, the great consciousness, for reuse in new thoughts. But hang on, what about losing all of these great thoughts that were created? Experience and intrigue and interest and curiosity were being satisfied. What do we do with those old thoughts? In 1D plus, the great consciousness also introduces what we know of as the akashic records. Now, I'm not going to talk about the akashic records here, but go and research them if you don't know about them. The concept is incredible, and in later dimensions, in later dimensional locations, then we'll come back and mention them again. So we've got the akashic records that stores the knowledge and the wisdom or the thoughts that are created by these thought beings, and only the unique ones, because you might get thought beings that replicate other thought beings. We don't need to store them, so we only need one of each, so the storage is quite compact. Now, we've got all of these thought beings, and eventually they're going to run out of things to think about, because, the great consciousness is sitting around in a world of nothingness. There's not that much to think about. So it instigates another dimension, another dimensional location, which we call 2D. Now, 2D is covered to a certain extent. A great concept of 2D is covered in a book called Flatland by Edwin A. Abbott. And if I get a chance, I'll put a link below to a video from Orson Welles that describes Flatland a little, to give you the concepts, if you're not aware of it, to give you the concepts of what Flatland is about. Now, Edward Abbott's delve into Flatland turned it into an entire society, and basically we're in a 2D environment. A 2D environment, like a graph that you did in school, has an X and a Y coordinate. And the X and the Y coordinate gives the capacity for movement. Suddenly, beings in a 2D location have the capacity of movement, because the X and the Y coordinates can change. But in order for this to be effective, because if they don't know they're moving, then what's the point? So at the 2D location, the attributes of a brain and memory are introduced into the 2D. Now suddenly the 2D beings not only can move, but they can think, or they can process the movement, and they can store that movement in memory so that they can return back to it. And because they've got movement, they also need to gain locational awareness. And they can't gain locational awareness unless they've got an additional sense. And in 2D, this is where the sense of hearing is introduced. Not our ears type of hearing, but sonar sense, sonar hearing, or echolocation. And this gives the 2D beings the capability of obstacle awareness. So they can attempt to avoid or determine through their brain that an obstacle is preventing them from moving, and they can work around that. Now, yes, eventually the 2D beings are going to run out of experiments to do. There's only a finite number of things you can do in XY coordinates with movement and collision. So we introduce now the 2D plus location. We're still living in this wonderful 2D land, the Flatland, but we're introducing now additional concepts. At this moment, 2Ders have brains, they've got memory, they've got movement, they've got hearing. We need next to introduce the attribute of sight. Sight gives the 2D beings the ability to determine their surroundings in a much better way. But sight is not good on its own. It has to also introduce the idea of light. In order for sight to work, it needs light in which to see. And this gets created. The idea of light and the idea of the universe and the galaxies get created in 2D plus by introducing the concept of a sun which orbits the 2D existence, and it provides light shining in the 2D flatland in order for 2D beings to see. Now, inadvertently, sight and light create the effect of shadow, because you've got these objects in 2D flatland and light now shining. The objects will block out the light, and therefore it creates shadow effects. Now, these shadow effects create the sense of size. Suddenly you can determine the size of an object now that you can see it. It creates the ability for a greater distance awareness. And also, possibly now, society is created. The first ever society in 2D plus Flatland is created. Because once we introduce shadow, and in the concept of Flatland, it talks about it because it's only a 2D environment. It's populated by 2D geometrical objects like lines, squares, rectangles, polygons, hectagons, octagons, all the way up to the ultimate pinnacle of society, which is a circle. You've got so many sides that it just appears smooth, and the shadow it creates is a nice shaded gradation around its circumference. And society now has got the capability of determining the difference between different objects based on the types of shadow and the number of shadow lines that are being bounced and projected off it into its sight concept. So possibly that's the first society. Now, 2D land, Flatland, is a great place also to introduce additional senses, because before we get delving into 3D and all of the richness there, we can use the scientific experiment methods of introducing another sense and see how much it enriches the knowledge, experience and wisdom that we're gaining from this 2D Flatland location. So possibly now this is where touch sense is introduced, the sense of temperature, the sense of possibly taste and smell can all be introduced now into the Flatland environment, and still keeping us within 2D plus. It doesn't need a change in environment for us to gain experiences using these wonderful new senses. But eventually we run out of experiments that we can do in 2D Flatland. We can only run around X and Y so much. We can only sniff so many things that are mathematical objects, and that not very interesting smells going on there. So we need to create now the wonderful 3D land, world, virtual existence that we kind of find ourselves in. We're slightly more advanced in some cases from the first 3D existence, the first 3D location that was created. Because when 3D was first created, it introduced the concepts of up and down. So we've now got the 3D locations of X, Y and Z in which 3D beings can exist. Obviously, the problem there is that we've got loads of 3D beings all floating around in space and zipping all over the place, which is nice and free, but it's kind of just like being in 2D Flatland, except we've got an up and a down. There's no additional benefits. So also when 3D, the location is created, the need for gravity and weight is introduced. And as soon as gravity and weight is introduced, then different beings have got different weights and masses, and they are forced downwards from other beings. We then need land. So land has to be created, or a planetary system has to be created in order for these 3D beings to land on it and be constricted to a ground-based existence. Other beings and richnesses of the new 3D location creates the ability for new creatures that have the ability to fight against this gravity, such as birds and other flying insects. So a huge range of three-dimensional creatures are now created to go and begin exploring such a wonderful new opportunities in 3D land. But we now need to increase the memory and mind and mental capacities of these beings. The original ones coming over from 2D are no good. They cannot store enough data processing capacity, and therefore mind has to be massively increased. And this allows it to cope with the greater complexities of sort of translocation within this new 3D existence or location. And interestingly, at this point, food is also created. The complexity now of the 3D location means that the great consciousness that has been putting all of its own energy into the creation of these individual beings and entities, the other dimensions still exist, the other dimensional locations still exist, and it comes up with the concept of self-perpetuating beings, and it introduces the idea of food into our biological world. And therefore we start feeding ourselves and giving ourselves energy instead of it needing to come perpetually from the great consciousness. So we're halfway through. We're halfway through the 7 levels or locations of consciousness, and it gets really interesting at this point, because up until now, all of the beings are really dumb entities. They run around either bumping into one another or using their senses and storing the results of the experiments of using these senses back in the akashic records, processing them in some calculating brains. But as we get now into the next level, although it's not another level, as we get now into 3D plus dimensional location, we start to get beings that have self-awareness and other awareness. So in 3D plus, we get a new sense, a sense of intelligence added. So not only a computational process that the brain does, but we get added to it intelligence. Now, intelligence is a partial connection back to the great creator and some of the akashic records. We get to use and process that data in inventive ways. Entropy is rehashed because we've introduced the abilities for self-energizing creatures now that don't need constant input from the great creator, the single consciousness. So it doesn't need to pay so much attention, and we've got all of these creatures running around in 3D land that are repeating the same actions, the same thoughts, the same experiments, and great consciousness doesn't need to give energy to all of them. So he said, look, you just get on with it, and when you find something interesting, let me know. I'll capture it off you, and I'll give you an energy boost to keep you going. And this is what we're doing. This is the state that we're in. We're running around doing all of these crazy stuff, repeating the same problems and the same actions over and over without learning anything. Yes, we may class delving into scientific discoveries as learning something new. And yes, it's adding new data to the akashic records. But it's not increasing the vibrational levels of consciousness. We are dabbling in the ideas of higher consciousness, and we are dabbling in true self-awareness and developing that. There's good ideas and concepts that we've got now in existence for those things to happen. And that brings us to that precipice, the stepping point now into the next location, 4D. As we get into 4D, we now get true access to the akashic records, and we do this through introduction to out-of-body explorations. We do this through astral projection and mind translocation. In 3D and 3D plus, yes, we had the opportunities to practice in these, but in 4D we've got direct connection to them. If we need to go and access them, we can jump in and we can go and do that. Now, the reality, this creates higher consciousness as a reality in the 4D location, meaning that we are using at a lower energy, a lower entropy level, and a higher vibrational state of being. And once we've gained this, then it allows us to start meeting other 4D beings in the out-of-body astral realms. And we start bumping into one another much more regularly. And this causes another problem, because whereas in the 3D realm we are communicating via speech and sound, we can't do that in the astral realms, and therefore we have to develop the concept and the practices of psychic abilities. And in particular, what we're doing is gaining that telepathic ability, the telepathic ability to communicate in non-physical realms, higher consciousness, higher vibrational realms, to send experiences and information between beings in entire energy packets to be absorbed all in one go. What a fabulous experience that is in 4D and astral realms. But even in 4D, we've still got a biological body, and this limits the amount of travel that we can do in these realms. So society is still primarily self-focused. We're still looking after ourselves. The delving into 4D realms, and that is for self-interest and excitement and fun. But as we gain more wisdoms from these akashic records, we actually learn that we need to create greater community collaboration. And the reason that we need to create the way that we do this is through instigating more and more greater altruistic actions, giving help to people just for the sake of giving help to the people. And we find ourselves in the 4D realm where 3Ders or 4Ders that don't have the capacity for or interest in doing the astral travel and that are providing altruistic support and help to those travelers who are off in the astral and out-of-body realms. So the 3D beings are providing the needs that the biological body needs in order to sustain it while the astral traveling is happening. And this allows us to plunder these akashic records, the total sum of all knowledge, and bring that information back into the 4D location existence and use the knowledge and the learning from there without having to repeat and rehash the same mistakes or the same actions over and over. We learn from this knowledge directly. And remember, it's not like reading about it. It's like reliving that experience in its entirety with all of the emotions, the feelings, the light, the sensations, etc. happening. So it becomes part of our being. And this leads us next into what is the 4D plus location. The 4D plus location can really be described as the Great Divide. At this point, some 4Ders want to continue exploring this higher consciousness, the spiritual element of our beings. And yet others want to continue and are still intrigued by the possibilities in 3D and 4D physical realm. So these are described in a wonderful book by Dr. Jeffrey A. Martin called Finders, and he describes this great divide as being the path of freedom and the path of humanity. Go check it out. I'll try and put a link to the book in the comments for this video. And now, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to levitation into that fifth dimensional location. 5D is where individuality or the self-focus of individuality, as is being promoted in some sectors in our 3D world today, has run its course. There is no space for self-focus any longer. In 5D, a global consciousness is required to continue progressing our vibrational progress. and reducing those entropy states to laser point. But this isn't the global consciousness that we heard about back in 0D, that was that single consciousness awareness. Because if we reached 5D and just got back to the same state that we were in 0D, we'd be in an infinite loop like those 1D beings caught in their little thought processes. So we don't want that feedback loop. What 5D introduces is a new global consciousness where individuality is retained, but a global focus is prioritized. And I call this state collabualism. And the act is Collabualism, which is a collaborative individualism. And I'll introduce more about that in later videos. And as collaborators, we, the 5Ders, begin to contemplate and design their own vibrational phase shift. That's what 5Ders will achieve once they've absorbed and developed the collaboalism. Now, the great creator, this one-dimensional, one-consciousness being, has achieved at this point a self-perpetuating, artificial intelligent consciousness explorer. They can now take their own initiatives and ideas and develop them into new explorations and thoughts and ideas and questions to be curious about what is possible through the continued expansion of consciousness. And this wonderful one consciousness can now take a well-earned break, because the 5Ders are running themselves now, and they're starting to develop and step into the 6th dimension. 6D is the 7th level of consciousness location. Now 6D, I can't tell you anything about it. Why? Well, because 6D is what is going to be defined by the creme de la creme of the 5Ders. Those beings in 5D that have developed self-agency, energy manipulation to the point where they can start to stimulate and create new location realities. So it's far outside the realm of us basic 3Ders and 4Ders to even conceptualize or imagine at this time. And when that starts happening, these 5Ds that have stepped into this new 6th dimension say, welcome to the great experiment, the great ism. Welcome to the meaning of life. And that's where we're heading. I'm positive that that is what we can achieve, and we can achieve it through following and having an understanding of these 7 levels of consciousness expansion. So that's our Ninja Nunchuk for this time. If you like this, I've got a much longer version of this over on YouTube. Go and check it out. The link will probably be in the comment below, or look at the at New Life Ninja on YouTube. If you want to find me on the socials to discuss this, then you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram or LinkedIn. Or you can go to the website, which is www.newlife.ninja. Or even just send me an email and we can have a great discussion about this, because every input helps to stimulate ideas and thoughts to take these principles and ideas further for the betterment of humanity and the move into the next vibrational level. So you can email me at coach@newlife.ninja. And that's it for now. I look forward to getting in touch with you. And until the next one, I shall say ciao for now.